Keanu Reeves stood in the first-class boarding line, dressed simply, an obvious contrast to the luxury surrounding him. A man nearby observed him with a look of disdain, his arrogance barely concealed. What happened next would leave everyone on that flight stunned and change one person's life forever. Before we continue with the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Another special story is coming your way tomorrow. Los Angeles International Airport was as bustling as ever, filled with travelers hurrying in different directions, conversations overlapping, and the constant sound of rolling luggage. Amidst the chaos, one man stood still and composed in the first-class line: Keanu Reeves. His outfit was unremarkable: a plaid shirt, well-worn jeans, and scuffed boots. A backpack, seemingly carrying the weight of many journeys, rested on his shoulders. There was nothing flashy about him, and because of that, most people didn't even notice him. Yet those who took a moment to really look could sense something different about him. It wasn't just his appearance, it was the sense of calm he carried. While the rest of the passengers looked anxious and rushed, Keanu remained peaceful, observing his surroundings as if simply taking in the moment. He didn't react to the glances sent his way, nor did he seem bothered by how different he appeared from the other travelers in first class. Standing behind him in line was Victor Harding, the complete opposite of Keanu. Dressed in an expensive, tailored suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that announced his presence before he even spoke, he carried himself with an air of importance. Every movement seemed deliberate, as though he wanted everyone around him to recognize his status. His eyes scanned the line until they landed on Keanu. He couldn't resist making a comment. "First class, huh?" Victor said with a smirk. "You never know who you'll run into these days." Keanu turned his head slightly, meeting Victor's gaze with an unreadable expression. "Yeah," he said calmly. "The world is full of surprises." Victor hesitated, expecting more of a reaction, some sign that his remark had struck a nerve. But Keanu remained unfazed, as if the comment had no significance at all. Unwilling to let it go, Victor pressed further. "Nothing personal," he continued with a chuckle, "but you don't seem like the kind of guy who usually flies first class. It's rare to see someone dressed so casually up here." Before Keanu could respond, the first-class line started moving. Without another word, both men stepped forward with their tickets. Victor walked with the confident stride of someone who believed he belonged there, while Keanu continued at his usual unhurried pace, unaffected by the urgency of those around him. When they finally boarded the plane, something unexpected happened. Victor glanced at his ticket one last time, and as he looked up, he saw Keanu settling into the seat right next to his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Letting out a quiet chuckle, he sat down, as if the situation was some kind of joke. Of all the seats on the plane, it had to be this one. Keanu turned toward him, his expression as composed as ever, and gave a small, polite smile. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said. Victor folded his arms, trying to mask his discomfort. It wasn't just about sitting next to Keanu. It was the realization that the man he had judged only moments ago now shared the same exclusive space as him, and for some reason, that fact unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. As the last economy passengers boarded, Victor decided to strike up a conversation, not out of curiosity, but to confirm what he already assumed. "So," he asked, his tone casual but calculated, "what do you do for a living?" Keanu, adjusting his seatbelt, looked up and calmly placed his backpack under the seat in front of him, then looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time projects?" Keanu gave a small, knowing smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Victor chuckled, his confidence unwavering. "You know, I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place in the world. But the truth is, some spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for example." Keanu studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. But instead of taking the bait, he remained composed. "I think we all belong exactly where we are," he said calmly. Victor let out a short laugh. "That's a nice thought. Philosophical even. But real life isn't that simple." Keanu didn't argue. He simply turned toward the window as if signaling the conversation was over. But Victor wasn't done. Leaning slightly closer, he lowered his voice. You might be sitting here, but let's be honest. There are things money can't buy. Some places, they'll never really belong to certain people. This time, Keanu didn't respond with words. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Victor, his expression unwavering, calm, patient, but with a quiet intensity that spoke louder than any comeback could. Victor, realizing he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted, leaned back in his seat with a smirk, convinced he still had the upper hand. What he didn't know was that this conversation was about to take a turn he never expected. As the plane soared through the sky, the in-flight service began. A flight attendant moved gracefully through first class, offering drinks. Victor, ever eager to assert his status, made sure to be noticed. A glass of champagne, please, he said with a confident smile. Something that matches the exclusivity of the seat. The flight attendant, used to passengers like him, nodded politely. When it was Keanu's turn, his request was much simpler. Just water, please. Victor couldn't resist another comment. He turned toward Keanu, amusement flickering in his eyes. Water? He asked, barely containing a chuckle. Don't tell me you're wasting a first-class experience on water. Keanu accepted the bottle from the flight attendant, his expression unchanged. I'm fine with this, he replied. Sometimes simplicity is enough. Victor narrowed his eyes as if trying to decipher whether that was wisdom or just an excuse. He wasn't about to let the moment slip. Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less, he said smugly. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer. Keanu raised the bottle, took a small sip, and remained silent for a moment. Around them, a few passengers had started to take notice, sensing the tension in Victor's words. But Keanu remained unfazed, as if none of it mattered. Maybe the best is different for everyone, he finally said, his voice as calm as ever. Victor's smirk faltered. He took a deep breath, determined to keep control of the conversation. Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters, he shot back. Some things are simply out of reach for certain people. A few rows away, the flight attendant discreetly glanced in their direction, perhaps debating whether to step in. But seeing how Keanu handled himself, she hesitated. There was no need. He had the situation completely under control. Keanu's only response was a slight smile as he turned back to the window, showing no interest in prolonging the exchange. Victor, however, wasn't satisfied. He wanted to provoke more, to get some kind of reaction. But something was becoming increasingly clear. Keanu was a difficult opponent to rattle. Victor believed he was winning the battle of words. But for those watching, the reality was obvious. His arrogance was turning into an uncomfortable spectacle. Meanwhile, Keanu's quiet composure was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. As the flight attendant made her way back through the cabin, serving another round of drinks, Victor saw an opportunity to continue his little game. He swirled his champagne glass, wearing a smug smile. You know, he began, his voice carrying just enough arrogance to make nearby passengers tune in. Life is a lot like flying first class. You work hard, earn your place, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky. Keanu placed his water bottle on the tray in front of him. This time he turned to face Victor directly. His gaze remained calm, but there was something different about it now. Something sharper, more resolute. Lucky or not, hard work or not, Keanu said, his tone steady but firm. We all land in the same place when the flight is over, don't we? A subtle tension filled the air. Passengers who had been quietly observing now leaned in a little closer. The quiet hum of the cabin seemed almost too still. A few exchanged knowing glances, sensing the unspoken weight behind Keanu's words. Victor, clearly caught off guard for a moment, forced a smirk. Well, I wouldn't say that. Some of us operate on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here. Keanu leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. I think the real value of being here, he gestured around the cabin, isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat people. The statement hung in the air like an undeniable truth. A few passengers nodded in agreement. Others shared quiet, approving glances. Victor, however, shifted uncomfortably. He forced out a laugh, but something in his demeanor had changed. That's a good one, he scoffed, trying to keep his usual confidence. First-class wisdom? Maybe you should start giving motivational speeches. Keanu responded only with a small smile before turning back to face forward, signaling the end of the conversation. No argument. No need to prove anything. And yet that silence spoke louder than anything else. Around them, subtle reactions began to unfold. Some passengers whispered to each other. Others threw Victor quiet looks of disapproval. A couple sitting a few rows behind, who had clearly recognized Keanu, said nothing, but their expressions showed admiration for how he handled himself. Victor, on the other hand, started to sense it too. The shift. The realization that the attention he was getting wasn't the kind he wanted. His once confident posture stiffened slightly, but he still wasn't ready to admit he was losing control of the moment. He had no idea that what came next would make him question everything he thought he knew about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant came by to collect empty glasses, Victor, still clinging to his argument, took one last shot. "You know what's funny?" he said, his voice a little lower now. "It's always the people with nothing to show for themselves who talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Keanu turned back to him, this time leaning in just slightly. His gaze was steady, unshaken. "I've noticed," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that the people who talk the most about what they have are often the ones who feel the emptiest inside." A beat of silence followed. Victor hesitated, caught off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The weight of Keanu's statement hung in the air. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, some visibly impressed, others quietly amused. Victor finally managed to recover. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," he said, his tone softer now. "But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people ignore you. That's just how it works." Keanu leaned back in his seat, his posture completely at ease. "Maybe," he said, pausing slightly, "but I think real success doesn't need to be announced. It speaks for itself." And this time, the entire cabin seemed to absorb the meaning behind those words. Passengers nodded discreetly, exchanging glances of silent agreement. Victor, for the first time since this conversation started, had no comeback. And what happened next? Well, let's just say the lesson wasn't over yet. The atmosphere in first class had shifted completely. What had started as a casual conversation had turned into something much more profound. Many passengers, initially just passive listeners, were now fully engaged, their attention locked onto the exchange between Keanu and Victor. An older gentleman seated nearby turned slightly, shaking his head in quiet disapproval of Victor's behavior. Others cast sideways glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Victor, sensing the shift, attempted to mask his irritation, but rather than backing down, he threw out another jab. "Sounds like cheap philosophy to me," he scoffed. "Nice words, but the real world doesn't work that way." Keanu remained as composed as ever, his expression unwavering. "The real world is made by people, Victor," he said calmly. "And in the end, how we treat others says more about us than anything else." Something about those words struck a nerve. Victor's confidence wavered just slightly. He glanced around, realizing that the energy in the cabin had changed. The eyes watching him weren't impressed anymore. Some passengers whispered among themselves. Others openly stared, their expressions shifting from amusement to disapproval. For the first time, Victor was starting to understand. His usual tactics weren't working. He had assumed he was in control of the conversation, but the weight of Keanu's words was turning the situation against him. And maybe, just maybe, it was making him question something within himself. The tension in the air was undeniable. Victor crossed his arms, trying to conceal his growing discomfort, but the frustration was creeping into his voice. Meanwhile, Keanu remained untouched by the atmosphere, radiating an ease that only made the contrast between them more apparent. Then, breaking the silence, Keanu spoke again, his voice calm, measured. "You know, Victor, I get what you're saying. The world can be incredibly competitive, but I've learned that the need to prove something to others usually comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an inner struggle." Victor narrowed his eyes, unsure whether this was another challenge or an attempt at something more genuine. He let out a sharp laugh. "Inner struggle?" he echoed. I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong. Keanu simply smiled, shaking his head slightly. Maybe, he said, but I've met plenty of people who thought success was all about what others could see, and deep down, they were just trying to fill a void they didn't want to admit was there. For the first time, Victor didn't fire back immediately. His fingers absent-mindedly toyed with the wedding band on his finger, a small, involuntary movement. But as quickly as the hesitation came, he forced himself back into his usual defensive stance. That's not me, he said firmly. Everything I have, I worked for. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life. Keanu studied him for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. I'm not saying you didn't work hard, he said, but sometimes we get so caught up in proving what we've achieved that we forget to ask ourselves, who are we without all of this? Victor pressed his lips together, his jaw tightening. The question seemed to hang in the air, reverberating in his mind in a way he wasn't ready to admit. With a short, cynical laugh, he shook his head. That's easy. We are what we build. Without it, we're nothing. Keanu held his gaze, his expression more serious now. I don't believe that, he said. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. In the end, what we show the world will always matter less than what we carry inside. He tapped his chest lightly, emphasizing the point. A quiet ripple went through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged subtle nods, while others simply sat in thoughtful silence. The words had landed, not just with Victor, but with everyone who was listening. Victor, however, struggled to maintain his composure. His shoulders tensed. His breathing grew shallower. He was losing control of this conversation, and worse, he knew it. Pushing back against the discomfort, he straightened in his seat, his voice rising slightly. That's easy for you to say, he snapped. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. His tone remained steady. You're right, he admitted. I don't know your story, but I don't have to know it to see this. When someone feels the need to constantly prove their success, it's often because they're trying to hide something. He let the words settle before continuing, his voice quiet but firm. Fear, insecurity, loneliness. Victor's face turned red, a mix of anger and perhaps shame. His fists clenched as he fought to keep his emotions in check. But then, unable to contain himself any longer, he shot up from his seat, knocking over his empty champagne glass. You think you're better than me? He shouted, his voice echoing through the cabin. Sitting there with your clever little sayings, acting like you have life all figured out. But you don't know what it's like to live in the real world. The entire first-class section fell into stunned silence. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, while a flight attendant hurried over, trying to de-escalate the situation. Keanu, however, remained calm. He simply looked up at Victor, letting the moment settle before he finally spoke. I don't think I'm better than you, he said, his voice steady yet gentle. I just believe that sometimes we need to pause and reflect on what truly matters. And Victor, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. The words struck deep. Victor, still breathing heavily, hesitated. Something in Keanu's tone made him lower his gaze and sink back into his seat. The anger in his expression faded, replaced by something far more vulnerable, an unspoken realization. For the rest of the flight, an uneasy quiet filled the air. Victor avoided looking at Keanu, but the weight of their exchange lingered. Keanu, on the other hand, seemed unbothered, as if nothing had happened. A short while later, a flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile. Her voice, though soft, carried through the cabin. Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to let you know that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his regards. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Reeves? Victor repeated under his breath, his eyes widening in disbelief. Keanu Reeves? A murmur spread through the cabin as passengers turned to get a better look at the man they had largely ignored until now. Some gasped quietly, while others exchanged surprised whispers. Meanwhile, Keanu simply nodded at the flight attendant, thanking her with his usual politeness. He turned to Victor, noticing the shock written all over his face. Something wrong, Victor? He asked with a small, knowing smile. Victor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced around, now painfully aware of the eyes on him. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by sheer discomfort. He fumbled for an explanation, his voice barely a whisper. I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say who you were? His words trailed off as he struggled to find an excuse. I didn't know that you were… you. Keanu let out a quiet sigh, leaning forward slightly. His tone remained calm, but there was an unmistakable firmness to his words. I didn't think it was necessary. I don't use my name as a badge of importance. Victor swallowed hard, trying to regain some composure. Look, I didn't mean to offend you, he stammered. I didn't know who I was talking to. Keanu studied him for a moment before replying. Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth isn't about who you're speaking to. It's about how you choose to treat people. Victor fell silent. The weight of those words sank in, leaving him speechless. Around him, other passengers listened intently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to contemplation. The silence stretched on until Keanu finally leaned back, closing the conversation with one last thought. You know, Victor, life is already tough for everyone. The last thing we need is people tearing others down just to make themselves feel bigger. Victor lowered his head, unable to argue. For the first time, he looked like a man truly reflecting on his actions. As Keanu settled back into his seat, the conversation had reached its natural end. But while his words had stopped, their impact lingered. Victor sat motionless, his gaze fixed on his hands, replaying every moment in his mind. It wasn't just Keanu he had been confronted by. It was reality itself. In his attempt to assert dominance, he had unintentionally revealed more about himself than he ever meant to. The rest of the flight was marked by an unusual silence. The once self-assured man who had commanded the room now seemed small, withdrawn. The arrogance he carried so effortlessly at the start of the journey had vanished, replaced by something much closer to regret. He stole a glance at Keanu, who now sat peacefully engrossed in a book, as if nothing had happened. And yet that only deepened the weight of the moment. Keanu hadn't needed to prove anything. He had simply let his actions and words speak for themselves. As the plane began its descent, Victor finally found the courage to break the silence. He turned to Keanu, his voice quieter than before, his eyes still lowered. I need to apologize, he admitted, not just because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. I acted like a fool. Keanu looked at him, his expression as calm as ever. He paused for a moment before replying, his words steady yet meaningful. I appreciate the apology, he said, but more than that, I hope you learn from this. Victor nodded slowly, realizing that this moment wasn't just about regret, it was an opportunity. Keanu continued, his voice thoughtful. Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we struggle to find within ourselves. I hope you figure out what truly matters. Victor didn't respond, but the words settled deep within him. For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside, something he wasn't ready to ignore. After disembarking, he stood still in the terminal, watching as Keanu walked away. He saw people quietly approach him, asking for photos, greeting him with admiration. Keanu met each one with the same patience and warmth he had shown throughout the flight. No rush, no ego, just genuine kindness. Victor looked down at his own hands and exhaled. He knew he had a lot to change. Keanu's words echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder that true worth isn't found in status, but in how we treat others. As Keanu disappeared into the crowd, Victor felt something unexpected. Hope. Maybe this encounter wasn't just coincidence. Maybe it was a chance to start over. Because in the end, we all carry the weight of our own choices. Are we living to impress others or to become better people? Keanu's lesson was clear. Success isn't measured by wealth or recognition, but by the positive impact we leave on the world and the lives of those around us. And perhaps the change we hope to see in others must begin within ourselves. If this story moved you, there are plenty more that will touch your heart. Click on the screen to discover more inspiring tales of hope, kindness, and perseverance.